The mill foreman laughed when Joel Crabbe asked what was in the sludge. "Mostly water and paper fiber," the man said, already pulling his collar up against the wind. "Goes alkaline as it dries. Don't spread it near anything you care about." He climbed back into the north gate, pulp and paper truck, without waiting for a response, and the tailgate swung shut behind him with a metallic clang that carried across the empty field and then disappeared into the gray November air. Joel was 15 years old and small for it, standing at the east fence of his family's property in worn rubber boots that had belonged to his father. A gray-white mound of paper mill sludge steamed faintly in the cold behind him. The smell was strange: wet wood pulp, flat chemicals, something almost like chalk. He didn't step back from it. He crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the edge of the pile. It was warm, not from the sun, which had given up on the day entirely and retreated behind a flat ceiling of cloud. Warm from whatever was happening inside it, slow and invisible. The town of Millhaven, Maine, didn't take long to form an opinion. By the following Sunday, 2 people at the hardware store had told Sandra Crabbe she'd made a mistake. A man named Gerald Foss, who ran the feed supply on Route 11, shook his head when he heard. "Paper sludge," he said to no one in particular. "That's what you put at the back of a property you've already given up on." Sandra Crabbe was 41 years old, with dark brown hair threaded through with early gray, and the kind of careful, measuring expression that came from years of deciding which problems could wait and which couldn't. She was not a woman who explained herself to Gerald Foss. She had accepted the arrangement with Northgate because the $150 a month they offered would cover the propane bill through February. And because her son had asked her to. That was reason enough. Sandra had grown up in Millhaven. She had married Terrence Crabbe at 24, moved with him to the 43-acre property his grandfather had cleared, and learned to love a farm the way you learn a second language. Slowly, with many mistakes, and eventually without thinking. Terrence had been the one who understood the land. He had a logger's patience, long silences, slow decisions, and a certainty about physical things that made other people feel steadier just standing near him. He died on a February morning 2 years earlier, when a cable snapped at a logging site 12 kilometers north of town. He was 38 years old. The ground had been frozen. The crew said it was fast. After that, the mortgage stayed. The rusted equipment stayed. The old blueberry rows on the east half of the property stayed, though they had never produced well. The soil was too alkaline, too sandy, too tired from years of neglect before Terrence had even bought the place, and Joel stayed. Joel Terrence Crabbe had turned 15 in October, and was quiet in the way that children sometimes become when the loudest person in their household is gone. He was thin, with his father's straight dark brows and his mother's watchful hazel eyes, and he had the habit of looking at things slightly longer than other people did, as if he were waiting to see what they would do next. He didn't complain at school. He didn't explain himself at home. But he noticed everything. He had noticed that the old blueberry rows on the east side never recovered fully between seasons. He had noticed that the soil beneath them was pale, almost powdery, and that when rain came it ran off the surface rather than soaking in. He had noticed, in a book left behind by his father, a single underlined sentence that read, "Blueberries want acid. Give them acid, and they'll give you everything." And he had noticed, in a Northgate pulp and paper information pamphlet left at the general store counter, that paper mill fiber sludge contained large amounts of organic cellulose material. He did not know yet what that meant, exactly, but he had the feeling, quiet, slightly stubborn, that it was connected to something. The first truck had arrived on a Friday afternoon. By the following week, the mound had grown to twice its original size, and a faint white vapor drifted off it on cold mornings like something breathing. Neighbors slowed when they drove past. A boy at school named Kyle Brewer, who was 14, broad-shouldered, and had spent enough time around his father's construction company to have absorbed certain opinions about losing propositions, called Joel Sludge Boy, in the hallway on Monday. A few kids laughed. Joel kept walking. That afternoon, he took the bus to the county library in Presque Isle, rather than coming home. The Aroostook County Library was a wide brick building with high windows and radiators that knocked every time the heat cycled on. Joel sat in the back corner near the science section, with a stack of books on soil chemistry, composting theory, and a worn manual called Organic Residuals in Agriculture that had a coffee ring on the cover from someone else's long afternoon. The librarian who noticed him first was Frances Dumont. She was 67, compact, with white hair cut close to her head, wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular alertness of a woman who had spent decades making sure children didn't leave a library without at least one answer they hadn't expected. She had taught biology at the regional high school for 31 years before retiring, and she still moved through the stacks with the efficient confidence of a person who knew where every answer lived. She set a copy of Field Guide to Soil Restoration on the table beside his elbow without being asked. Joel looked up. "You've been reading about paper sludge for 45 minutes, she said. "That book has a chapter on it." She paused. "The alkalinity is the problem, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. Joel nodded carefully. "The blueberries need acid. The sludge is alkaline, but the sludge has a lot of organic material in it." Frances pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "So what do you think happens when you put an alkaline material on top of acidic pine duff and leave it long enough?" Joel was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet." "That's a good place to start," she said. She found him 3 more books that afternoon and wrote down the name of an agricultural extension office in Orono that would answer questions by mail. Joel came back the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. Frances always found something useful to leave near his elbow. She never made him feel small for not knowing. She seemed to understand, in the particular way of people who have seen many kinds of struggle, that he wasn't there to hide from the world. He was there because the world outside the library had been trying to convince him to give up, and he was looking for a reason not to. The reason arrived in a footnote. In an old agricultural journal from 1987, Joel found a paper from the University of Maine that described using paper mill fiber sludge as a mulch layer over acidic sandy soils in lowbush blueberry production. The sludge, the paper explained, broke down slowly. As it decomposed, the alkalinity dropped. The organic matter released nitrogen, and when layered over natural pine needle duff, already slightly acidic, the combination over 2 or 3 seasons could actually improve blueberry soil conditions rather than damage them. The key word was layered, not spread, not tilled in, layered on the surface and left. Joel sat very still in his library chair. Then he opened his notebook. He had already tried it wrong once. In the second week after the first delivery, he'd borrowed a flat shovel from the shed and spread a thin layer of fresh sludge across one short row of blueberry canes on the south edge of the property. He'd worked for 2 hours, and the smell made his eyes water. And when he finished, he stood back and felt, briefly, like someone who had done something real. A week later, the blueberry canes in that row had gone pale at the tips. The soil beneath the spread sludge smelled chalky and sharp. Sandra found him standing there one evening, looking at the pale canes with the expression of someone reading bad news. She didn't raise her voice. She looked at the row for a moment, then at him. "Clean it up," she said, "then find out why it didn't work." Joel had wanted to say that he'd been trying to help. He'd wanted to explain that he'd seen something possible in the warmth of that first pile, something that felt like it wanted to be more than waste. But his mother's face was tired and direct, and the words stayed inside. "I'm sorry," he said. Sandra put one hand briefly on his shoulder. "Being sorry doesn't fix the row," she said. "Figuring it out does." That was the sentence he carried back to the library. By early spring, Joel had built his first windrow. He raked pine needles from the stand of trees at the north edge of the property and piled them in a long, low ridge along the east fence line, parallel to the struggling blueberry rows. Then he added a layer of wood chips he'd negotiated from a tree service crew working down the road. The foreman had been happy to dump a load rather than haul it to the transfer station. On top of the chips went a measured layer of paper sludge, thinner than what Joel had spread the first time. On top of that, more pine duff. Then he waited. He checked it every afternoon. He wrote down what he saw in his notebook. The smell changed first, from alkaline and flat to something earthier, closer to the floor. Then the color of the outer layer shifted from gray-white to a dull tan. By the end of April, the inside of the windrow, when Joel pushed a stick into it, was warm and dark and threaded through with pale, fungal growth the color of old linen. He didn't tell anyone except Frances Dumont. She drove out to the farm one Saturday in May in a dented blue station wagon and crouched beside the windrow with her glasses pushed up on her forehead. "Decomposition fungi," she said. "They're breaking down the cellulose." Joel crouched beside her. "Is that good?" Frances pressed 2 fingers into the dark interior and brought them to her nose. "Smells like a forest floor," she said. "Yes, that's good." Kyle Brewer called Joel Sludge Boy for the rest of that school year. He said the Crabbe place smelled from the road. He said you could tell which way the wind was blowing by which direction you wanted to avoid walking. Other kids listened when Kyle talked because his family had a working business and a new truck, and that was the kind of authority that moved through the hallways of a small-town school without needing to explain itself. Joel heard all of it. He didn't respond. He went back to his fence line, his notebook, and his rows. The first blueberries grown in the amended soil were small, dense, and so dark they were almost black at the center. Sandra brought them to the Millhaven Farmers Market on a Saturday in late August, packed in paper pint containers because they hadn't yet invested in anything better. Joel stood beside her under their borrowed canvas tent, straightening the hand-lettered price signs twice before anyone stopped. The woman who stopped first was Margot Dunn. She was 52, with a broad, freckled face, copper-red hair going gray at the temples, and the practical directness of someone who had built a small jam company called Dunn's Wild Kitchen. From a single rented kitchen into a retail contract at 2 health food stores in Bangor, she picked up a blueberry and tasted it before she asked anything. "Where is this soil?" she said. "East property," Joel said, "by the fence line." Margot looked at him steadily. "What did you do to it?" "Paper mill sludge, pine duff wood chips, 2 growing seasons." She bought all 4 pints. She came back an hour later and asked for everything Sandra hadn't sold. By the time the market closed, the Crabbe family table was empty. Joel stood behind the folding table and looked at the space where the containers had been. It was not much money, but it was money made from something a mill foreman had laughed about, and a neighbor had called a sign of surrender, and a boy at school had used to make a hallway feel smaller. And more than money, it was proof. He carried the used windrow material that autumn behind the old equipment shed and spread it thin over the poorest corner of the east field, the place where even clover refused to stay. He turned it into the surface soil with a garden fork, raked it flat, and waited through the winter. In early May, earthworms appeared in that corner for the first time. 6 years later, the east field of Crabbe Farm looked like a different piece of land. The blueberry rows had expanded from 4 to 18, and 3 of them were in commercial production. Joel had built a processing shed with help from a retired French-Canadian carpenter named Albert Viau, a wiry man in his late 70s with enormous white eyebrows and a blunt, unhurried way of working that Joel had come to trust completely. Albert had lost his own small farm in Quebec 20 years earlier and never spoke about it directly. But he had a particular gentleness when he was working on something that belonged to someone else's future. "You build it right the first time," Albert told Joel while they framed the shed door. "Or you build it right the second time. Either way, you build it right." Joel was 21 now, broad through the shoulders in a way that had arrived gradually, and then all at once. He wore his father's old work cap and a short beard that made him look older in photographs than he felt in the morning. He moved through the farm with the unhurried certainty of someone who had learned the hard way that panic cost more time than patience. Sandra had stopped apologizing for the farm. That was the change Joel noticed most in her. In the years when everything was uncertain, she had carried a particular expression. Not fear exactly, but the careful look of a woman who had taught herself to prepare for the next difficulty before the current one had finished arriving. Now there were evenings when she sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea and looked out over the blueberry rows without saying anything, and her face was simply quiet. Margot Dunn had become their steadiest buyer. Dunn's Wild Kitchen now featured Crabbe Farm blueberries in 4 of its products, and the label on the back of every jar read, "Grown in amended soil, Millhaven, Maine." A specialty food retailer in Fredericton, New Brunswick, had placed a standing order after a regional food fair. A restaurant in Bar Harbor served Crabbe blueberries with their breakfast menu and listed the farm by name. Not everyone who had laughed had disappeared entirely. Some had simply stopped saying things. Gerald Foss nodded now when he saw Joel at the hardware counter, which was more than he had managed for several years. Kyle Brewer, who was now driving a truck for his father's construction company, slowed near the Crabbe driveway one afternoon and looked at the hand-painted sign at the gate. Crabbe Farm, Millhaven, Maine, and kept going without a word. Joel watched the truck move down the road and didn't feel what he might once have expected to feel. Only something quiet, like a door closing softly in a room where it had stood open far too long. The person who changed the direction of the farm arrived in early September. Dr. Heather Voss was a soil scientist from the University of Maine, 48 years old, with a lean, weathered face, close-cropped auburn hair, and the kind of careful attention in her eyes that made people feel she was reading things they hadn't said aloud. She had grown up on a potato farm in Aroostook County and lost it to drought and debt when she was 22. That loss had shaped everything she had studied since. She did not speak of soil as dirt. She spoke of it as something closer to a community. She spent 3 hours walking the property with Joel, digging test holes, examining roots, smelling the finished compost, and turning handfuls of the dark East Field soil through her fingers. At the end of the visit, she sat at the kitchen table with Joel's old notebooks, the ones with cramped handwriting from when he was 15, and read through them slowly. "You created a closed cycle," she said finally. "The sludge breaks down into organic matter. The organic matter builds the soil. The soil supports the blueberries. The blueberry prunings go back into the compost. The compost feeds the next season. Nothing leaves the system that doesn't come back." Joel looked out the window at the rows. "I just didn't want to waste the waste," he said. Dr. Voss looked at him. "That's what the best farmers always say," she said. "And they always say it like it's simple." 7 years after the first Northgate truck had left a gray-white mound steaming at the east fence line, the letter arrived. Sandra found it on the kitchen table beneath the hydro bill on a Monday in late October. She read it once. Then again, then set it down and called Joel in from the shed. The letter was signed by Morgan Sellers, who had joined Northgate Pulp and Paper the previous spring as the new operations manager. Morgan Sellers was 39 years old, clean-shaved, with a narrow, organized face and pale gray eyes that moved quickly when he was assessing a situation. He had spent a decade in regional resource management and had a talent for identifying what he called underused revenue streams. He had looked at the sludge disposal arrangement with Crabbe Farm, reviewed the tonnage records, run a calculation, and concluded that the fiber sludge Northgate had been depositing at no cost could instead be sold to a commercial composting facility in New Brunswick. The letter stated that fiber sludge deliveries would end within 60 days. It cited new waste diversion protocols and a revised environmental compliance strategy. The final paragraph noted that Northgate reserved the right to review costs associated with previously deposited material if the receiving party had derived commercial value from it. Sandra read that last line twice. "What does that mean?" she said. Joel took the letter, read it, and folded it once along its original crease. "It means he thinks the sludge is worth something now." Sandra looked out the window at the compost windrows, where the last of the season's processing was still warm beneath the October sky. And if the trucks stop coming? Joel was quiet for a moment. He thought about the windrow system, the 18 blueberry rows, soil test results, the supply chain, built delivery by delivery over 7 years. The sludge was the first input in every cycle. They had other organic materials, pine duff, wood chips, leaf litter collected from town, but replacing the volume and consistency of the fiber sludge would cost time, money, and trust he'd have to rebuild from nothing. "Then we show him what it became," Joel said. He called Northgate that afternoon. The receptionist put him through to an assistant, who told him Mr. Sellers was in a meeting. Joel left his name, his number, and a single sentence. Ask him to come see the farm before he sends the next letter. Morgan Sellers called back the following morning. He agreed to visit, though he said he could spare 30 minutes. He arrived 2 days later in a dark gray company truck, wearing a jacket that was too light for the Maine October, and shoes that had not been designed for gravel. He stepped out and looked at the farm with the careful, neutral expression of a man who had learned to show nothing until he had finished deciding what he was looking at. 7 years of sludge deliveries, he said, glancing toward the east fence. "And you think that's worth a conversation?" Joel stood at the gate in his work boots. He had the calm of someone who had spent years not arguing and had found it more effective than almost anything else. "I didn't ask you here to talk about sludge," he said. "I asked you here so you could see what we built from it." Morgan gave a brief, uncertain sound, almost a laugh, not quite. Joel opened the gate. Morgan saw the processing shed first, organized, clean, with labeled bins for each composting input and finished compost bags stacked neatly along the rear wall. Then he saw the windrow rows, long, dark ridges that steamed faintly in the cold air, each one turned and worked in careful sequence. Then he saw the blueberry rows, 18 of them running east to west across soil that was nearly black. The harvest was finished for the season, but the canes were healthy, dark red with autumn color, pruned clean, with good ground cover between each row. A small hand-painted board near the gate listed the current supply partners. Sandra was moving boxes in the wash station. She nodded once at Morgan when he passed and kept working. Joel said very little. He let the farm speak for itself. At the far end of the east field, the corner where nothing had grown before, where even clover had refused to stay, Joel crouched beside one of the older rows. The soil there was loose, dark, and crumbled easily between his fingers. He handed Morgan a laminated copy of Dr. Voss's soil analysis. Organic matter in the east field had risen from less than 1.5% to just over 6% in the restored sections. Soil pH had stabilized within the range optimal for low-bush blueberry production. Water retention had improved significantly. Microbial diversity had increased with each testing cycle. Morgan read the document without speaking. His 30 minutes had passed without either of them noticing. "You built all of this from the sludge," he said. "From sludge, pine duff, wood chips, one bad growing season, a library in Presque Isle, and about 6 years of making mistakes slowly enough to learn from them," Joel said. Morgan looked at the rows again. He turned the soil report over in his hands. "The termination letter," he said after a long moment. "I'll hold it." The formal agreement was signed the following spring. Northgate Pulp and Paper would provide documented, graded fiber sludge deliveries to Crabbe Farm under a structured agricultural partnership. Crabbe Farm would process it into certified soil amendments and finished compost. Northgate would use Crabbe Farm compost in the mill's grounds restoration project and co-sponsor an annual visit for regional high school agriculture students interested in sustainable land use. On the morning the first official delivery arrived under the new arrangement, Joel and Sandra stood at the east fence line together. The driver, the same man who had been coming for 7 years, who had never once asked what Joel was doing with all of it, backed the truck carefully toward the new receiving bay Joel had built over the summer, concrete-edged and properly graded. The sound of the hydraulic bed lifting was exactly the same as it had always been. But the driveway was different. The fence was different. The soil beyond it was different. Sandra watched the truck, then looked at her son. "Your father would have loved to see this," she said. Joel looked at the dark rows, the windrows, the small shed, the sign at the gate. "He taught me how to love this land," Joel said. "I just learned how to listen to what it needed." Sandra didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she put her arm around him, briefly and without ceremony, the way she had when he was small and the world had felt much larger than he knew how to manage. And beyond them, where a mill foreman had once reversed a truck without bothering to get out, where neighbors had slowed down to shake their heads, where a gray-white mound had steamed in the November cold, and a boy had crouched beside it and felt warmth under his fingers. The soil held everything they had put into it. Every failure, every winter, every early morning when no one else believed the work was going anywhere. It held all of it, and it was ready to give it back. There is something worth holding on to in a story like this one. Most of the people who drove past the Crabbe Farm in those early years saw an ending. They saw a family that had already lost too much, making one more decision that would cost them. They saw waste in the truest sense, something used up, unwanted, deposited without care at the edge of a property that already had enough to carry. Joel Crabbe pressed his hand into the same pile and felt warmth. He did not know in that moment what it would become. He only knew that it was not finished, that there was still something working inside it, quietly and out of sight. The way things sometimes work when no one is watching, no one is applauding, and the only person still paying attention is the one who cannot afford to look away. That is not a rare kind of person. It is the kind of person that every difficult season produces, in every town, in every family that has faced a long winter with fewer resources than the problem requires. Perhaps you know someone like that. Perhaps you are someone like that. If there is something in your life right now that looks like a gray mound at your fence line, a debt that keeps arriving, a door that will not open, a loss that changed the shape of everything around it, it may not be the ending it appears to be. Sometimes what we are given looks like nothing at all, and sometimes, if we are willing to stay close enough and patient enough to learn what it actually is, it becomes the very thing that builds us back. Keep working, keep reading, keep pressing your hand into the hard things until you find where the warmth is hiding. Because it is there, it nearly always is.